First, it was Kenya, and then came Nepal, followed by Morocco, and now we're tracking a deepening political crisis in Madagascar, where nationwide youth-led protests, initially sparked by a crippling lack of water and power, have now morphed into a demand for President Andry Rajoelina's resignation. Now, the president has dismissed his cabinet and claimed the unrest is an attempted coup, while the UN reports that at least 22 people have been killed in the security crackdown. At the moment, we have a panel of distinguished analysts to dissect this complex and volatile situation. And today we're joined by Nciko, a thematic researcher, Madagascar and climate justice advisor, East and Southern Africa. We also have Dr. Bakarr Bah, presidential research professor of sociology in Northern Illinois University. And we also have Richard R. Marcus. He's a professor of global studies, California State University. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us at this time. All right. So
thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. So let me begin with Nciko. Nciko, this particular protest, were triggered by the collapse of basic services. Can you tell us how critical is the failure of the state-owned utility, that's Jirama, to reliably provide water and electricity? And to what extent does this symbolize the complete breakdown of social contract between the government and the Malagasy people?
Well, thank you very much for the question. So for those who know Madagascar, Madagascar is a country that is really endowed with significant natural resources that for so many years have not been deployed to serve the socioeconomic needs of the population. And reports have been there of endemic corruption, really covering like the ways in which the government has been like handling these issues. But to understand this protest, we really need to understand the demography of Madagascar, the population of Madagascar. And about half of the population are young people who are about 20 years old. So it is in this context because it is really a whole society issue, because they are at the forefront of the lack of these basic services. So the protest started by really speaking about water shortages, power cuts, and then you could see that the protesters could easily link this to broader socioeconomic issues in the country, to do with corruption and to do with bad governance. So it's really in this context that the protest came about. And they just started with a group of young people between 17 and 24, putting a call on social media that you are taking the street to protest about these particular issues. But the issues did resonate with the majority of the population, not only in Antananarivo, but also other parts of the country.
All right, now, just as you've said, Nciko, beyond the power cuts, protesters are targeting deep-seated corruption and are now explicitly demanding the prosecution of powerful figures. Does this focus in any way indicate that the youth are no longer willing to settle for superficial reforms, but are demanding an absolute overhaul of the political economy? And this question is for you, Dr. Bah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, thanks for that overview there. I mean, these are things that we see repeatedly in similar countries, in Madagascar, and for sure. And the question really is, how do you get out of this situation when you have endemic corruption? Certainly does require significant political change. The problem is that political change in Madagascar and similar countries mostly means moving from one political party to another political party, and they have, I believe, two parties that dominate. So in a sense, I mean, you still kind of play within. Political change can often actually play within the system, as you can see. I mean, appointment of a new prime minister and so forth. So, to answer your question, I think this will really require a two-stage kind of approach or solution. Certainly, I mean, one is to meet immediate demands or make immediate concessions, and bring in hopefully credible people, who will commit to actually deeper reforms. And I think until you get to deeper reforms, that will always, continue. Because in a sense, it is not so much for the lack of elections. I mean, Madagascar have been having elections. So I think clearly we know that it is not the lack of formal democracy in a sense, but it is actually about the absence of meaningful democracy, one in which actually that is able to go beyond bad governance in its most extreme form, that is corruption. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. But certainly there needs to be a way first to calm the situation and make concessions that will actually be acceptable to the youth. And from there, the real thinking should begin.
All right. Now, over to you, Professor Marcus. The president himself first took power in a 2009 coup, and now he has dismissed the youth movement as being exploited to provoke a coup as well. So I would love to hear your thoughts, looking at this, at his history and also the genuine grassroots nature of the Gen Z demands. Is this claim primarily a political tactic designed to silence dissent, and justify the security crackdown?
A little bit to say, he took over in 2009, but then ultimately did cede power, and then came back in elections thereafter, some years later. So we look at from 2009 forward as another period because he was elected. So we do have more than one period. Where they hold similarities, though, and to the import of your question, is that in both cases there was extra constitutional action, unseating the president, and in this case he is accusing the same. That's true, or the attempt at the same kind of extra constitutional action. But of course, in this case, he's the one that's already in seat.
Okay. Now, still on you, Professor Marcus. One of the youth leaders, were quoted or was quoted saying that, and I quote, "We are just young people ready to change the history of Madagascar." And we've seen a similar issue, in Morocco. We've seen a similar issue in Kenya and the likes. How effectively are the youths utilizing social media to overcome the traditional barriers of state control?
Media is incredibly effective in Madagascar, as we've seen in other countries. And I would go further to say, Madagascar has this long history of social movements that are directly tied to the failure of institutional structures. So looking at 1972 or 1991 or 2002 or 2009, as you mentioned, all cases where the institutional frameworks in hand of government did not allow for the participation or decision-making of the populace in a way that was accepted. So stepping out of that formal framework was in the main seen as part of a legitimate political action. So what's different now, though, is that we have this communication, as you say, via social media that allows for much more grassroots kinds of response without the kind of centralized leadership from an opposition leader, as we've seen in the past, leading to a much more uncertain way forward than we have in the past. In each of the other cases, there were very clear potential next steps that could happen. In this case, there's no clear set of demands for what comes next, vision or imagination for what comes next, because the effort, as in other countries, is not just to change who's in power, who the particular leader is. It's to change the nature of leadership, of governance itself, of the regime itself. So what that would look like afterwards is very different and very unclear.
All right, now to pick up from where you actually stopped, we're passing this question to Nciko. Nciko, President Rajoelina has dissolved his cabinet but refused to step down. Instead, he named the army general as new prime minister. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a meaningful concession or a tactical stunt just to diffuse the anger of the protesters?
So, to answer that, we really need to appreciate the way the government has been responding to the protest since the 25th. So protest happened on 25th. On the 26th, the first thing that the government was to actually fire the Minister of Energy because the issues were water and electricity. And then the protesters, it's like they were testing the power of the government. They made another demand. The demand was, now we want you to dissolve your whole cabinet, which he considered again. But now when they proceed and call out now, we want you as the president to now leave power as well. That's when we saw now a switch in the narrative of the government. And now the narrative now is that the country is under cyber attack. We have not really done, as Amnesty International, a political power analysis to see whether there's some internal divisions within the government itself. But this is really like a clear indication that we might still be seeing protests in Madagascar going on for a while, because the protesters, the Gen Z movement, were actually asking the government for them to be involved in the nomination of the prime minister. But the prime minister that has been put there has come from military ranks. And the narrative now is that all these protests are somehow being maneuvered to manipulate, young people and to really like facilitate a coup, which actually had like broader issues in terms of human rights, because now protesters are not going to be charged only with what the government has been doing over the years, which is the fact that against all human rights obligations of Madagascar, in Madagascar, if you participate in a protest that has not been authorized, that participation alone could take you to prison. But here now we are dealing with questions of like treason, and the penalty for that is actually the death penalty. So it's really like the government tightening really further its oppressive tactics, just because the protesters, we are seeing them now really go outside of the modus operandi, the playbook of the government when it comes to handling protesters. Because in the past, what we've seen has been to just target the protest leaders. But with the Gen Z movement, you have protest leaders in the diaspora and within Madagascar, behind an Instagram account, behind a Facebook account. So it has become really complex for the government to manage protests as it has been doing in the past.
Yeah.
Because in the past, the government could simply target the protest leaders, put them in prison for about like 2 months or 3 months, and then release them on suspended sentences.
But now there's no face. Yeah.
Come again, please?
I said, but now there's no face, related to the protests. It's just
which becomes complex, and now we are reviewing the oppressive tactics. And now, like this coup d'etat narrative, we really need to watch it closely, because activists might be charged with treason only for exercising their right to peaceful protest.
All right. Now, Dr. Bah, no doubt this has definitely left a political vacuum. So what is the current state of decision-making within the administration, and how vulnerable is the fragile state, to a complete breakdown of order amidst the street violence, even with the Army General in charge now?
When you get to these kinds of escalating, political violence situations with a government that actually lacks credibility, and actually with a political system that really lacks credibility with the masses, increasingly decision-making moves more and more to the security forces, militaries, and the like. So I think the answer really to your question here, that currently, my speculation would be that the president, is pretty much, working closely with his security allies, military people, and I think that's where decisions are primarily made, because increasingly this is taken more and more as a security issue, as opposed to really a civic issue. Now, if within this process, it swings back to the emergence of some kind of civic leader, which is difficult, with online or cyber kind of like driven protest. But if if a representative of the youth emerges, then that allows for, I guess, negotiation to begin. And in that process, again, you may end up having potentially an agreement. So really, the central question about decision, first and foremost, this is increasingly becoming militarized. It's becoming, made mostly through the security process, and I think that's where the president is leaning. What we can really hope for is that, it can swing back more to the civic aspect of things, and that requires the emergence of actually civic leaders that can negotiate the fundamentals with the government. Now, when you go to the fundamentals here, I think this is really the issue here, because again, as I was saying before, you do need, of course, some immediate things to cool things down again, as the other gentleman was saying. I mean, this demand, that demand. But the hard work really has to begin about rethinking, regimes, even if it's a democratic or even if it is an elected regime, rethinking regimes that actually do not breed the same kind of systems of governance that actually oppresses people, and in a very, very visible way. So I think there's a very hard task here. Whether they actually take a very authoritarian approach, which will not be good, or whether they actually begin to really, go the civic route and, and engage in meaningful change.
Okay, now let's, while we're winding down, let's hear from Professor Marcus. So far, 6 major international partners, including the EU and France, have issued a joint statement calling for a constructive dialogue. And we know that, there hasn't been a resolve, when it comes to dialogue. Is this response strong enough to exert any meaningful pressure on the Rajoelina regime, or does the history of coups in Madagascar demand a more decisive stance, from the likes of the African Union or even the SADC?
It's a great question, and I don't think that alone is a sufficient measure. There is a history of that kind of national dialogue. There was success with the FFKM, for instance, the Council of Churches, in the early 1990s. Less of an influence in the 2 large social movements since. But that's the current move, is to try to bring in a national dialogue from the FFKM. And there can be some success potentially out of that. However, I agree with my colleagues that the current move to bring in Prime Minister Zahumbu and to crack down harder is a security response. And that's consistent with this government, that we've seen a response that is entirely security as opposed to political economic in other cases, such as cattle rustling in the South, where there's not been consideration of the political economic drivers for why there would be youth participation in cattle rustling. So there's a history of this with the current government. So as we think about the other international institutions, it'll be hard because President Rajoelina has a lot of strength with those institutions, including his current leadership role with SADC. So I don't think we will see a lot of pressure from those organizations in that way. I think that internal pressure to try to figure out a way that doesn't lead to true disintegration is the next consideration. And can the FFKM or other kinds of civic roles lead to enough of a concession from government to be satiating? I have my doubts, but that's the greatest hope.
Oh, okay. So, well, let's have your final thoughts, Nciko.
Yeah, the Malagasy government has to really comply with its obligations at the level of the African Union, at the level of the UN, and now more than ever, given the leadership of the Southern African development community that they have. And this is really as simple as protest is not a crime. The role of the government is not to repress protesters. It is to really respect the protests, not to interfere with the protests as they are ongoing, to facilitate them, and to protect protesters from any form of violence that may come from third parties. So our goals have been really that the law is not silent, even as protests are ongoing. The Malagasy government has to really embark on effective and thorough investigations into the killings that have been there and into the injuries that have been inflicted upon people. And so far, the government has been arresting people on unknown charges, and they've been placed in unknown locations. So the government has to also release all people who have been arrested simply for exercising their rights to peaceful protest. And there is a law that is in place that has been allowing the Malagasy government since the 1960s to repress protesters, a law to regulate public assemblies and public meetings, which is actually from 1960. And it goes against all international obligations of Madagascar when it comes to managing peaceful protest, because it's actually give security officials sweeping powers to repress protesters as they're doing right now. And even courts of law themselves are somehow really bound by this particular law, which goes against the international obligations and regional obligations of Madagascar.
Okay.
And really the government has to listen and consider and take into account the demands of the protesters.
All right, well, let's hope they do that soon enough. Let's hear your final thoughts as well, Dr. Bah.
So, there's a long history here, and we keep on seeing the same things again across. And there are a number of things here I think that's important to note. One is that we know these kinds of governments, typically their primary interest is to stay in power, just by their very nature and their past history, so we know that. Number two, for the country to actually move past this, I think there needs to be like some serious thought and leadership. And that is most likely going to should come actually from the people out of the government, the civic people, the clergy, youth and so forth. And I think they have to go to fundamental question. That is, why is the political system not working? Okay, because again, as I said, it's not for the absence of election. So I would say, once the dust settled here, once they, pick up the pieces here, they should really go back to fundamental questions about why Madagascar governments repeatedly end up being corrupt, and not respecting the people. And there needs to be some thought about how the state is designed, how the government is designed, and what are the incentives of power, and to be in it and out of it. And then from there, think of a political system that will actually create much more better stability and responsibility. Again, that sounds a little bit idealistic, almost utopian. But I think we know there's a difference between countries that keep on going through repeated violence and countries that are far much more stable, and delivers. And I think the task for every person who is a leader, religious leader, civic leader, political leader, and so forth, is to ask yourself the deep question: what are the structural things that we can realistically solve in the political system? And from there, then the work will begin.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Bah. Professor Marcus, do you have any final thoughts?
I agree that we need a conversation about why is the system working, how the state is designed, what are the incentives of power, and there to be a real discussion and for this to be addressed. However, I'm very concerned with the from here to there part of it, that what's different in Madagascar in this Gen Z movement from some others is the relative weakness of the state and the lack of potential leadership to step in. If there's success of the movement, then there's a very real risk that it can lead to fracturing in a way that can have generational impacts, negative impacts economically and politically. It'll also leave a vacuum that different political operators can step into and make things far worse as opposed to better. That's not to say that the concerns of Gen Z protesters are misplaced. They're very real. It's just that without that imagination for what comes next, I'm concerned that it's actually opening the door to further disintegration as opposed to the kind of growth that clearly they're seeking.
All right. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time. Nciko, thematic researcher, Madagascar and climate justice advisor, East and Southern Africa. Dr. Bakarr Bah, Presidential Research Professor of Sociology, Northern Illinois University, and Richard R. Marcus, Professor of Global Studies, California State University. Thank you so much once again.